October 3, 1884, Abilene, Kansas. The wind kicked up dust across the depot yard as the last train of the day pulled away, whistling long and lonely into the dusk. Jackson Merrick swung down from his buckskin gelding and watched the platform clear. He had come to meet a shipment of tack and seed ordered from Wichita, but instead, what caught his eye was a woman sitting alone on the wooden bench near the far end of the depot. She looked like she had been there for hours. Her dress was plain, faded blue cotton, hands folded tight in her lap. A carpetbag sat by her boots, scuffed and sun-worn. Her hat had slipped back, revealing soft brown hair pulled into a neat but tired bun. She was not crying, but her eyes were red. Still, her chin held a quiet strength that stuck with him. Jackson stepped closer, boots thudding on the warped planks. "Ma'am," he said, tipping his hat. "You waiting on someone?" She looked up slowly, blinking as if waking. "No," she said, her voice was low even. "No one's coming." He glanced down the tracks, then back to her. "Train's gone. You got anyone in town?" She shook her head. "No. I was supposed to go on to Dodge, but plans changed." She did not offer more, but Jackson was not the kind to push. Still, something about her, maybe how she held herself like she was trying not to fall apart, made it hard to walk away. "You got a name?" he asked. "Willa Monroe," she said. "And you?" Jackson Merrick. He nodded toward her bag. "You hungry, Miss Monroe?" She hesitated. "I do not have anywhere to go." "Well," he said, offering a hand, "you do now." She stared at his hand, then up at him, unsure. He did not rush her. Finally, she reached forward and let him help her stand. She was light, like she had not eaten right in days. "What happened?" he asked gently as they walked toward his horse. "My uncle was meant to meet me," she said. "He wrote saying I could stay with him in Dodge, help with his store. But when I got here, I had a telegram. He passed last week, heart stoppage. No one else to take me in." Jackson's jaw tightened. "You've been sitting here all day," Willa nodded. He helped her up into the saddle, then swung up behind her. "You will stay at my place tonight," he said. "It is 10 miles west, not fancy but clean, safer than out here." "I do not want to be a burden," she said. "You are not," he said. "Trust me." They rode in silence as dusk deepened into night. The land stretched wide and dark, the stars bright above the prairie. Willa held the saddle horn tight, her back close to his chest. Jackson kept one hand loose on the reins, the other lightly steadying her. When they reached his homestead, the lamps were lit inside. A modest cabin stood against a backdrop of cottonwoods, a barn beyond. He dismounted first, then helped her down. "You can take the bed," he said, pushing open the door. "I will take the cot." She looked around. The place was clean, worn but kept. A small stove, a pine table, 2 chairs, a few books stacked on a shelf. It felt lived in. "You live alone?" she asked. He nodded. "Since my folks passed. Been running cattle, working the land." Willa sat down slowly at the edge of the bed. "Thank you, Jackson, for not leaving me there." He knelt by the stove, stoked the fire. "The world may have passed you by, Willa," he said, glancing back at her. "But I never will." Her breath caught. She looked down at her hands. "You do not even know me." "Not yet," he said. "But I would like to." That night she slept in his bed, and Jackson stayed up late on the front porch, smoking a pipe and looking out across the plains. The next morning she was in the kitchen early, making coffee. She still looked weary, but there was warmth in her eyes now. "I can help around here," she said. "Cook, clean. I know how to mend, too." "You do not owe me anything," Jackson said. "I want to," she replied. Over the next week, Willa stayed. She made herself useful. She swept, cooked meals, tended the small garden behind the house. Jackson rode out each morning to check fence lines and cattle, and each night he returned to the smell of stew or cornbread, her quiet smile waiting by the stove. One night after supper they sat on the porch as the sun dipped low. "I had a brother," she said softly. David. He died 3 years ago, fever. After that, there was no one. My aunt passed, then my mother. Jackson watched her face, the way her voice stayed steady even as her hands shook a little in her lap. I am sorry, he said. I thought I was going to start over in Dodge. I thought I had a place. She looked out at the horizon. But I guess that was not meant to be. Maybe it was never meant to be Dodge, he said. Maybe it was meant to be here. She looked at him then, long and quiet. You really would have stayed at that depot all night, he asked. She nodded. I did not know what else to do. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees. You do now. A few days later, he brought her into Abilene for supplies. People stared. Some Willa was a stranger, and folks in town could be sharp-eyed, but she held her head high. Jackson kept close beside her, hand brushing hers once, twice, until she finally took it. By week's end, the cot was gone from the cabin. They shared the bed without speaking on it. It just made sense. One morning before sunrise, Jackson woke to find Willa leaning against him, her head on his chest, fast asleep. He wrapped his arm around her and pulled her closer. She stirred, eyes half closed. Jackson, I am here, he said, and she smiled, soft and sure, like she believed him. The late October wind had stiffened, carrying the sharp scent of drying prairie grass and distant wood smoke. Jackson leaned against the barn wall, arms crossed, watching Willa hang linens out along the line. Her sleeves were rolled past the elbows, and her hands moved with quiet purpose, pinning each sheet without pause. You ever work on a place like this before? He asked, his voice low enough not to startle her. No, she said, not turning. But I watched my mother enough to know how to keep things in order. He stepped closer, the grass whispering under his boots. You want to try your hand at something different tomorrow? She looked over her shoulder, eyes curious. There's a neighbor north of here, Mrs. Caffrey. Her boy's been poorly since the frost came through. I was thinking of riding over, checking in. She could use another woman's voice. Willa hesitated, adjusting the last clothespin. I don't know her. You don't have to, he said. She's the sort that welcomes kindness without asking questions. Willa nodded once, then turned back to the linens. Then I'll go. Jackson saddled the mare just after dawn the next day. Willa packed a small cloth bundle with dried apple slices and a folded scrap of muslin she'd hemmed by hand. She said little on the ride north, but she didn't seem afraid. Her posture in the saddle had grown steadier, and she no longer gripped the horn like she was bracing for bad news. When they reached the Caffrey place, the front door opened before they even dismounted. Mrs. Caffrey, broad-shouldered and sun-tanned, stepped out with a dish towel over one shoulder and concern etched deep across her brow. That you, Mr. Merrick? Brought someone with me, he said. Willa Monroe. She's got a calm way about her, Mrs. Caffrey's gaze moved over Willa, pausing at the bundle in her hand. Well, she said. Come on in then. Boy's been coughing near 2 days straight. Can't get him to eat. Willa followed her inside without glancing back. Jackson stayed outside, tightening the cinch on his saddle and giving them space. She stayed inside nearly an hour. When she returned, her cheeks were flushed and her hands smelled faintly of camphor and onions. She didn't speak until they were halfway home. He just needed someone to sit still with him, she said. Mrs. Caffrey's been run ragged. She's not had sleep in 2 nights. Jackson kept his eyes on the trail ahead. You helped. I didn't do much. You stayed, he said. That counts. They rode the rest of the way through brittle light and low clouds. At the cabin, Willa went straight to the stove and began slicing potatoes into a pan without prompting. Jackson sat nearby, rubbing the trail dust from his neck with a damp rag. I thought about teaching, Willa said after a while. Back when my brother was still alive, he always said I'd have made a fine schoolmistress. You got the patience for it. She looked over her shoulder, studying him. "Would you ever leave here?" "Go somewhere with more people, more to do." Jackson leaned back in his chair. "I've seen enough to know I don't care for crowds. Land's honest. It gives back what you put in. That's enough for me." She nodded and went back to the pan. The scent of browning butter filled the small space. Later that evening, Jackson brought in a small cedar box from beneath the bed. He set it on the table and opened it without a word. Inside were a few folded letters, a brass button, and a red ribbon gone pale with time. "My ma kept this," he said. "Wrote to her sister in Missouri, but they never answered after 72. She kept writing anyway. Every few months." Willa reached out, fingertips grazing the paper edges. "She must have had hope." "She did. Right up until the end." He closed the lid gently and looked at her. "You got anything you want to keep safe, Willa? This box has room." She didn't answer right away. Then she reached into her skirt pocket and laid a thimble beside the box. It was worn smooth, the metal dulled by years of use. "My mother's," she said. "She wore it like a ring." He picked it up, turned it over in his palm, and placed it carefully inside. When they turned down the lamps that night, Willa slipped beneath the quilt and lay quiet. Jackson climbed in beside her, and the room fell still. After a stretch of silence, she reached for his hand under the covers and held it firm, her thumb brushing his knuckle. "I feel safe here," she whispered. "You are," he said. She moved closer, resting her forehead against his shoulder. "I don't want to be passed by anymore." Jackson turned to her, pressing his mouth to her hair. "You won't be, not while I'm breathing." And she believed him, not because he said it softly, but because everything he'd done had proved it true. By early November, the prairie had turned the color of old wheat, and the wind carried a sharper bite. Jackson had begun stacking firewood against the cabin wall, and Willa had taken to stitching thick curtains from heavy canvas to keep the cold from creeping in through the gaps in the windows. One morning, Jackson returned from checking the southern fence line with a slight limp in his left leg and a stain of dried blood down his pant leg. He eased off the gelding with a wince. "What happened?" Willa asked, stepping down from the porch with a basin of water still in her hands. "Barbed wire caught me wrong," he said, brushing dust from his coat. "Fool thing was loose and snapped." "Sit down," she said, already turning on her heel. "I'll get the carbolic," he grunted, but didn't argue, lowering himself onto the porch step. She returned with a cloth, the bottle, and a strip of clean linen. Without a word, she knelt and rolled up the fabric of his trousers to the knee. The gash was shallow but wide. She cleaned it gently. "You stitched this yourself, if I'm seeing right," she said, examining the rough black thread. "No time to ride back," he muttered. "Did what I had to." She didn't comment, just tied the dressing firm and neat. When she sat back, her hands rested in her lap a moment longer than needed. "You always take care of things alone." He looked down at her gravel-streaked boots. "Wasn't much choice." "There's a choice now," she said. He met her eyes then. She didn't flinch from the weight of his gaze. "Not used to relying on anyone," he admitted. "Neither am I," she said. "But I'm learning." That evening, she didn't ask him to rest. She just took up his usual place by the stove, stirring the beans and checking the bread. He watched her from his chair, a book open but forgotten in his hands. "You read much?" she asked, glancing over. "Used to," he said. "Pa taught me with the Bible and a book of cattle breeds. Got a few others tucked away." She dusted flour off her hands. "I had a teacher once who said books made the world bigger. I think that's true, but I also think the world is big enough without them." He tilted his head. "You miss it?" "Reading regular," she shrugged. "Sometimes, but most days I'm just glad to have quiet." After supper they didn't speak much. She sat near the hearth, darning a wool sock, and he cleaned the rifle by lantern light. Outside, coyotes called sharp and distant. When the lamp was turned down and the fire banked low, Willa stood by the window a long time, looking into the dark. "You ever think about what life would have been like different?" she asked. He didn't answer right away. "No point thinking on roads not taken." "I used to," she said, voice soft. "I thought I'd marry someone with a shop or a school and spend my days keeping accounts or teaching letters. I never thought I'd end up waiting alone at a train depot." He rose and crossed the room to stand beside her. "And now," she turned toward him, her face shadowed in the low light. "Now I think I was meant to wait." He touched her hand, slow and deliberate. "I'm glad you did." The warmth between them was steady, not rushed. She didn't step away. He didn't pull her closer. They simply stood, hands touching, the world outside the window stretching wide and silent. The next day brought a letter from town, delivered by the son of a nearby homesteader. Jackson opened it at the table, brow furrowed. "Bank wants to reevaluate the grazing lease," he said, folding the paper with a sigh. "New assessor coming from Topeka next week." "Does that mean trouble?" she asked. "Could. Depends on whether he's got dust in his boots or just ledgers in his head." She leaned her elbows on the table. "Is there anything I can do?" He shook his head. "Just keep doing what you've been doing." The morning of the assessor's visit, Willa packed biscuits and cold ham into a cloth bundle without needing to be asked. She handed it to Jackson as he saddled up. "Don't let them talk you into anything foolish," she said. He gave her a half smile. "I'll be back before dark." When he returned, dusk was already stretching across the sky. She was waiting on the porch with a lit lantern and an extra coat slung over one arm. "Well," she asked. "Man didn't know a Hereford from a fence post," Jackson said, swinging down from the horse. But he listened. "Lease is safe." She handed him the coat, relief softening her shoulders. "I'm glad." He took it, but instead of putting it on, he reached for her hand. "You were what I came home to," he said simply. Willa didn't answer right away. Her eyes searched his face as if memorizing the lines there. Then she stepped into him, her hand resting over his heart. "You're the first place I've ever felt like I belonged." He wrapped his arms around her, not with urgency, but with the quiet certainty of something that would not be undone. Inside the cabin, the fire waited, and the kettle sang low on the stove. Neither of them moved to go in just yet. The night was cold, but they were warm enough, standing close, the prairie moon rising clear over the fields behind them. The first snow came early. It wasn't heavy, just a thin veil over the prairie grass, but it hushed the land. The horses stood quieter in the pasture. Even the wind seemed to pass through the cottonwoods with more care. Willa woke early that morning, the light outside soft and gray, and stepped barefoot to the window. The pain was cold beneath her fingers. She didn't speak until Jackson stirred behind her. "You ever get tired of the quiet?" she asked, voice low. He sat up, rubbing his face. "No," he said. Not tired exactly." She kept her eyes on the horizon. "Sometimes I just wonder if we'll always be this tucked away." He rose, pulling on his shirt. "You wanting something else?" "I don't know yet," she said. That day they worked side by side in the barn, mending harness straps and checking feed bins. Willa held the leather steady while Jackson punched through with the awl. Her hands had grown stronger, steadier, but she still flexed her fingers after each stitch. "You ever been west of here?" she asked, threading the needle again. "No farther than Colorado line," he said. "Why?" "Heard once that there's land out in New Mexico where the rocks turn red at dusk. Thought maybe I'd see it one day." He looked up, surprised. "You still think about leaving?" Her eyes didn't waver. "Not leaving, just knowing what's out there." He nodded, slow. "If you ever want to go see it, I'll ride with you." She smiled, faint but sure. "I'd like that." A week later, the Caffrey boy began to recover, and Mrs. Caffrey rode over to return a pie tin Willa had lent her. She stayed through coffee, her boots resting near the stove, and spoke about a new schoolhouse being planned near the creek bend. "They're looking for someone steady," she said. "Someone who can keep a room of young minds from jumping out the window." Jackson glanced at Willa, but didn't speak. Mrs. Caffrey caught the look. "You'd suit just fine," she said to Willa. "They'd take to you quick." After she left, Willa sat by the table, turning the empty tin in her hands. "You want to take it?" Jackson asked. "I don't know," she said. "A part of me wants to see if I can still do something like that. The other part wonders if it's too late to start again." He pulled a chair across from her. "You didn't stop being who you are just because the world changed around you." She looked at him for a long moment. "Would you mind if I tried?" "I'd be proud," he said. The first time Willa stood in front of the half-framed schoolhouse, her fingers curled tight around a slate board. She felt the ground steady under her feet in a way it hadn't since the day she stepped off that train. She didn't tell Jackson about the nervousness that had crept in the night before. She hadn't needed to. He'd left a small, folded note under her sewing basket, scrawled in his careful hand, "You are exactly where you're meant to be." That evening he waited by the fence as she walked back from the creek bend, cheeks pink from the cold. She carried a book of primers under one arm and looked tired but lit from inside. "They listened," she said, breath clouding in the air. "Even the stubborn ones." He grinned. "Told you." She stepped closer, slipping her hand beneath his coat. "I want to build something here, Jackson, not just keep it going, really build it." "Then we will," he said. Together. That night, as the fire burned low and the wind moved across the eaves, Willa reached for his hand beneath the quilt. Her voice was quiet but sure. "I didn't come here to fall in love." "I know," he said, pulling her closer. "But I did," she said. "And I don't want to go through another winter without being your wife." He didn't speak right away. He just held her, forehead resting against hers, the silence between them full and warm. "You won't," he said. "Not ever again." And in the hush of that snow-wrapped cabin, with the firelight dancing across the walls and the soft rhythm of breath between them, the promise settled in like roots deep, quiet and unshakable. The wedding was a quiet one, held beneath the bare-limbed cottonwoods behind the cabin, the air crisp with late November chill. The ceremony was witnessed only by Mrs. Caffrey, the Foyt brothers from the neighboring claim, and the preacher who came in from a day's ride west. Willa wore a wool dress dyed deep green, one she had pieced together over the past weeks by lamp and needle. Jackson stood beside her in a clean shirt and his father's old vest, the buttons polished with ash and oil until they gleamed. When the preacher asked if they came of their own choosing, Jackson didn't glance aside. "I've known it since the day she looked up at me at the depot," he said. Willa's answer was simpler. "I'm home now," she said. Afterward, they shared coffee and preserves on fresh bread beneath the gray sky. The preacher rode off before dusk, and the others left them with quiet nods, and a few offerings, a length of cured ham, a quilt stitched with initials, a jar of pickled beets Willa laughed over but set gently on the shelf. That night, after the fire had burned low and the lanterns were turned down, Jackson pulled her close beneath the quilt, their knees touching, his thumb brushing a slow circle at her wrist. "You sure?" he asked, voice low. "I've never been more," she whispered. "This is the first time I've ever been wanted without having to ask for it." He didn't speak again. He only kissed her like he meant to keep her safe for the rest of his life. The weeks that followed fell into a rhythm so natural it surprised them both. Willa rose before the light to prepare the kitchen for the day, her palm resting on the doorframe as she watched the frost melt from the grass. Jackson took to the barn early, hauling hay and checking the animals, the ache in his leg eased by motion, and the knowledge that someone would be waiting when he came back through the door. The schoolhouse took shape quickly. By early spring, it had 4 walls of thick pine, windows set deep with glass brought in by wagon from Junction City. Willa took it upon herself to whitewash the boards inside, her hands red and raw by the time she finished. She never complained. When Jackson brought her water and sat beside her on the stoop, she leaned her head against his shoulder and said, "We're building something that'll outlast us." "You always talk like that," he said, amusement in his voice. "Like you're already looking back from 70. "I had to start thinking ahead young," she replied. "When everything you knew could vanish in a week, you learned to plan for what comes next." He picked up her hand, traced the line of her fingers. "What comes next for us?" She didn't answer right away, but her fingers laced through his and held on. By the time summer came, the garden behind the cabin had doubled. Willa planted beans, squash, and a row of sunflowers that leaned toward the light like they knew something worth hearing. Jackson added 2 more head of cattle to the herd, trading a set of harnesses and a repaired wagon wheel for the pair. The land yielded enough to make next winter seem less uncertain. One morning, Willa stood brushing her hair before the mirror when Jackson stepped up behind her and laid a folded piece of paper on the table. "What's this?" she asked, her reflection catching the curve of his smile. "Application for the school board. They want you to take over once the building's ready." She looked down at the paper, then back up at him. "How'd they even know I could raid?" "I told them." "You didn't ask me first. You told me once you weren't sure if it was too late to start something new," he said. "I figured I'd help you find out." She turned, resting her hands at his waist. "You always push me forward." "I just hold you steady," he said. "You do the rest." He kissed her then, slow, with the kind of certainty that left no room for doubt. By the time the leaves began to yellow again, the schoolhouse opened its door. Willa stood before a line of children with their boots scuffed and hair combed flat by mothers with hopeful hands. She taught them letters, numbers, and how to listen without fear. When she came home in the evenings, Jackson was usually already at the table, hands washed, the stove warm. One evening, as the sun dipped low and the fields turned to gold, she stepped out onto the porch and found him watching the horizon, a slip of paper in his hand. "What's that?" she asked, easing down beside him. "Land offer," he said. "South pasture. Foyts are moving east to be near kin. They're selling cheap." She looked out toward the boundary fence. "You think we can manage more, he said. "I don't make decisions without you." "Not anymore." She leaned into him, her head beneath his chin. "Then let's grow it, slow and steady." They bought the land with the savings they'd tucked away, and come spring, they planted alfalfa in the new fields. Willa taught through the week and walked the fence line with Jackson on Sundays, hand in hand. The years passed not quickly but well. They never left Kansas, never saw the red rocks of New Mexico. But Willa didn't mind. The world beyond never pulled at her the way it once had. She had her work, her home, and the man who stood beside her through every storm and season. They grew gray together. The lines in their hands deepened, and Jackson's leg grew stiff in winter, but he never stopped rising first to light the stove. Willa's hair thinned, but her gaze never lost its steadiness. On their 30th anniversary, the schoolchildren grown now, with children of their own, gathered in the schoolyard with baskets of food and stories of the woman who taught them more than words. Jackson stood beside her, his hand wrapped around hers. "You were right," she whispered as the sun dipped behind the cottonwoods. "This place was always enough." He turned to her, eyes soft. "You made it so." And they stayed that way, hands joined, hearts steady through every season left to them. The land didn't change much, but it held them, year after year, and they held each other just as sure in the end. They weren't remembered for grandness or fortune, but for kindness, for quiet strength, for the way they built a life from nothing but trust and time. And neither one of them was ever left behind again.